The silence between strangers can hold more truth than a lifetime of words. In a dusty cafe where the coffee grows cold and dreams come to die, a 10-year-old girl with dirt under her fingernails watches a broken man push beans around his plate, like he's moving pieces of his shattered life. She's been following him for days, stealing his leftover biscuits and listening to him whisper to ghosts under the Nevada stars. Tonight, something shifts in the autumn air. Tonight, she finds the courage to speak the words that will change everything. You look hungry too. Sometimes salvation comes in the smallest packages, delivered by the most unexpected messengers. Subscribe to witness how two lost souls find their way home to each other. The cafe smelled of burnt coffee and broken promises, its wooden floors scarred by the boots of men who had somewhere else to be. Jonas Hale sat in the corner booth, the same one he'd claimed for 3 nights running, his weathered hands wrapped around a cup that had long since gone cold. The beans on his plate remained untouched, arranged in neat little rows like the headstones he'd left behind in Colorado. Outside, the Nevada wind carried the scent of sagebrush and the distant promise of winter. But inside this forgotten place on the outskirts of Carson City, time seemed to move like honey through a broken jar. The other patrons, drifters, prospectors, and women with tired eyes gave him the wide berth that grief demands, as if sorrow were something that might spread like wildfire if they got too close. He'd been talking to them again last night, to Mary and little Samuel, his voice carrying across the empty desert like a prayer that had lost its way to heaven. The words came easier in the darkness, when the stars looked down like the eyes of the dead and the coyotes sang their lonely songs to the moon. He told them about the cattle he'd sold, about the money that sat heavy in his saddlebags, like stones in a drowning man's pockets. He told them about the dreams that visited him in the small hours, dreams where they were still alive and waiting for him to come home to their little house with the yellow curtains and the garden where Mary grew tomatoes that tasted like summer itself. But morning always came with its cruel light, washing away the illusions and leaving him alone with the terrible weight of breathing when they could not. The cafe owner, a woman named Dolores with silver hair and knowing eyes, refilled his cup without being asked, her movements gentle as a mother's touch. She'd stopped trying to make conversation after the first night, recognizing in his silence the kind of pain that words could only make worse. The coffee was bitter and strong, the way men liked it when they needed something to burn away the taste of regret. Jonas lifted the cup to his lips but didn't drink, watching instead as the steam rose and disappeared, like everything else he'd ever loved. The autumn light, filtering through the dusty windows, painted everything in shades of amber and loss, and he found himself thinking about the way Mary used to hum while she cooked, how the sound would fill their kitchen like music made of hope. A child's laughter drifted in from somewhere outside, high and bright as a bird's song, and Jonas felt something twist in his chest like a knife finding its mark. Samuel had laughed like that once, before the fever took him, before Mary followed him into the ground 3 days later, her heart simply refusing to beat in a world that no longer held her boy. Jonas had buried them both under the cottonwood tree behind their house, had stood there in his Sunday clothes while the preacher spoke words that meant nothing to a man whose God had turned his face away. The laughter outside grew fainter, carried off by the wind like everything else that mattered, and Jonas pushed the beans around his plate with his fork, creating patterns that made no sense in a world that had stopped making sense the day his family died. The door chimed as someone entered, but Jonas didn't look up, didn't want to see another face that would remind him of all the faces he'd never see again. His reflection stared back at him from the window glass, a stranger with hollow cheeks and eyes that had forgotten how to hope. The man in the glass looked older than his 47 years, worn down by grief like a stone polished smooth by an endless river of tears. He'd been handsome once, Mary used to tell him, running her fingers through his dark hair and tracing the lines around his eyes that came from squinting into too many sunrises. Now those lines had deepened into canyons, and his hair had gone grey at the temples, as if sorrow had painted him with its own cold brush. The weight of the silence pressed down on him like a physical thing, heavy as the dirt they'd thrown on Mary's coffin, heavy as the words he'd never said, and the time he'd never get back. He thought about the letter in his pocket, the one from his brother in California, full of talk about new beginnings and fresh starts, about orange groves and ocean breezes that could wash away a man's troubles. But Jonas knew better than to believe in such things now, knew that some wounds went too deep to heal, some losses too great to overcome. The cafe around him buzzed with the quiet conversations of people who still believed in tomorrow, and he envied them their ignorance, their ability to plan and hope and dream as if the world were a safe place where good things lasted and love didn't end in graveyards. She had been watching him for 4 days now, this small shadow with tangled brown hair and eyes the color of winter sky, following him from town to town like a ghost that had forgotten how to haunt properly. Tessa Quinn moved through the world with the careful silence of someone who had learned that being noticed usually meant being hurt, her bare feet making no sound on the dusty boards of the cafe porch as she pressed her face to the window. Inside, the sad man sat in his corner booth again, staring at food he wouldn't eat while the world moved around him like water around a stone. She knew about hunger, the kind that gnawed at your belly and the kind that ate at your soul. And she could see both kinds written in the slump of his shoulders and the way his hands shook when he thought no one was looking. The autumn air bit at her thin dress, a faded blue thing that had belonged to someone else's daughter before it found its way to the orphanage where Tessa had spent the last 3 years of her 10-year-old life. She'd run away from that place of grey walls and gruel-thin soup, where the matron's switch fell like rain on children who dared to dream of something better. The road had been her home for 2 weeks now, sleeping in barns and eating whatever she could find or steal, following the railroad tracks west because someone had once told her that California was where broken people went to become whole again. But it was the cowboy who had caught her attention, this man who talked to the stars like they might answer back, who carried his grief like a heavy pack that he couldn't set down. She'd heard him the first night, camped by a creek outside of Reno, his voice carrying across the water as he spoke to people who weren't there. "Mary, darling, I saw a hawk today that reminded me of the way you used to watch the sky," he'd said, and Tessa had crept closer, drawn by the tenderness in his words. "Samuel, you would have liked the way it soared, free as anything." No. The pain in his voice had made her chest ache in a way she didn't understand, a recognition that passed between one broken thing and another. She'd stolen a biscuit from his saddlebags that night, but she'd also listened to his stories about a woman who grew tomatoes and a boy who chased fireflies, and for the first time in years, she'd felt less alone in the world. Now, pressed against the cafe window like a beggar at a feast, she watched him push food around his plate and wondered if he knew that grief was something you could share, like bread or warmth, or the weight of carrying too much sorrow for one person to bear. The other people in the cafe moved around him like he was invisible, but Tessa saw him clearly, saw the way his jaw clenched when children laughed, saw how his eyes went distant when couples walked by holding hands. She recognized the look because she'd worn it herself, that expression of someone who had been left behind by the world and didn't know how to catch up. The matron at the orphanage had called it the look of the unwanted, but Tessa thought it was more like the look of someone who had loved too much and lost too completely. Her stomach growled, a sound that seemed loud as thunder in the quiet evening air, and she pressed her hand against her belly to quiet it. She'd eaten nothing but wild berries and creek water for 2 days, her last stolen meal a distant memory that made her mouth water with longing. But it wasn't just food she craved as she watched the cowboy sit alone with his untouched plate. It was the warmth of human connection, the simple comfort of being seen and acknowledged by another living soul. She'd been invisible for so long that sometimes she wondered if she was becoming a ghost herself, fading away bit by bit until nothing would be left but the echo of footsteps and the memory of a girl who had once believed in kindness. The cafe door stood before her like a threshold between one life and another, and Tessa felt something shift inside her chest, a courage she didn't know she possessed rising up like water from a deep well. She thought about all the nights she'd spent listening to his whispered conversations with the dead, how his voice had become as familiar as a lullaby, and she realized that maybe they were both hungry for the same thing, not just food, but the simple grace of being known by another human being. Her hand trembled as she reached for the door handle, her heart beating so hard she was sure everyone inside would hear it. But she pushed forward anyway, driven by a need that was stronger than fear. The chime above the door sang out as she stepped inside, and every head in the cafe turned to look at this small, dirty girl who had appeared like something conjured from the desert wind. But Tessa only had eyes for the cowboy in the corner, this man whose grief had called to her own loneliness across the vast emptiness of the Nevada night. She walked toward him on legs that felt like they might give way, her bare feet silent on the worn wooden floor, and when she reached his table, she slid into the seat across from him with the quiet determination of someone who had finally found the courage to stop running. "You look hungry too," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, and in those 4 simple words she offered him the only thing she had left to give, the recognition that he was not alone in his suffering, that someone else in this world understood what it meant to be empty and aching, and desperately in need of something that couldn't be bought or stolen or found at the bottom of a bottle. The morning came with a chill that cut through the thin walls of the boarding house, and Jonas found himself listening for the sound of small feet on creaking floorboards before he remembered that the girl, Tessa, had curled up in the corner chair like a wounded animal seeking warmth. She was already awake when he opened his eyes, sitting perfectly still with her knees drawn up to her chest, watching him with those unnervingly direct eyes that seemed to see straight through to the hollow places he kept hidden. There was something unsettling about being observed so quietly, so completely, as if she were memorizing every line of grief etched into his weathered face. He had grown accustomed to being invisible in his sorrow, to moving through the world like a ghost haunting his own life. But this child saw him with a clarity that made his chest tighten with something between panic and relief. When he sat up and reached for his boots, she simply nodded as if they had already agreed on some unspoken plan. And he realized that somewhere in the space between her quiet words and his reluctant acceptance, they had become traveling companions. The trail west stretched before them like a promise written in dust and stone, and Jonas found himself adjusting his pace to accommodate the shorter stride of his unexpected companion. Tessa walked beside his horse with a determination that belied her small frame, never complaining about the heat or the distance, never asking for water when he knew she must be thirsty. She had a way of moving that reminded him of the wild creatures that survived in this harsh landscape, alert, efficient, wasting no energy on unnecessary motion. When they stopped to rest in the shade of a twisted Joshua tree, she would sit close enough to feel safe, but far enough away to run if needed, and Jonas recognized the careful distance of someone who had learned not to trust too easily. He wanted to tell her that she didn't need to be afraid of him, that he had no intention of hurting her, but the words felt clumsy and inadequate in his mouth. Instead, he shared his water without comment and pretended not to notice when she saved half of her hardtack for later, the practiced hoarding of someone who had known real hunger. As the sun climbed higher and the desert began to shimmer with heat, Jonas found himself talking, not to Tessa, but to the empty air, the way he had grown accustomed to speaking to Mary and little Samuel in the long months since their deaths. He told them about the strange turn his journey had taken, about the girl who had appeared like an answer to a prayer he hadn't known he was praying. Tessa listened without interruption, her face serious and attentive, as if she understood that these conversations were sacred, that the dead deserved to be included in the business of the living. There was something profoundly comforting about having a witness to his grief, someone who didn't try to comfort him or tell him it was time to move on, but simply accepted that love didn't end with death. When he spoke Mary's name, his voice breaking slightly on the familiar syllables, Tessa reached out and touched his horse's flank with gentle fingers, a small gesture of understanding that said more than any words could have. In that moment, Jonas felt something shift inside his chest, a loosening of the tight knot of pain that had lived there for so long he had forgotten what it felt like to breathe freely. The afternoon brought them to a creek that ran clear and cold between banks lined with cottonwoods, their leaves already turning gold with the promise of winter. Jonas dismounted and led his horse to drink, while Tessa knelt at the water's edge, cupping the precious liquid in her small hands and drinking deeply before splashing her face and neck with obvious relief. She had removed her worn boots and was soaking her feet in the shallow water when Jonas noticed the blisters on her heels, the raw places where the leather had rubbed her skin bloody. The sight hit him like a physical blow, a reminder of how young she was, how vulnerable, how completely dependent on his protection, whether she admitted it or not. He found himself kneeling beside her, his hands surprisingly gentle as he examined the damage, his voice rough with emotion as he told her they would rest here for the night, that her feet needed time to heal. Tessa looked up at him with something like surprise, as if kindness was a foreign concept, and Jonas felt his heart break a little more for this child who had learned to expect so little from the world. That evening, as they sat beside a small fire built from driftwood and dried grass, Jonas found himself really looking at Tessa for the first time, not just seeing her as an interruption to his solitary grief, but as a person with her own story, her own losses, her own reasons for being alone in this vast and unforgiving landscape. She was thin in the way of children who had missed too many meals, her clothes patched and repatched with careful stitches that spoke of someone who had once cared for her properly. Her hair was the color of wheat in summer, tangled and sun-bleached, and her eyes held depths that no 10-year-old should possess, the kind of knowledge that came from seeing too much too soon. When she spoke, her voice was soft but clear, telling him about the family she had lost to fever, about the relatives who had promised to care for her, but had instead seen her as a burden to be passed along. She spoke without self-pity, stating facts as simply as she might describe the weather, but Jonas heard the carefully controlled pain beneath her words and recognized a kindred spirit in the art of carrying unbearable loss. As the fire burned low and the stars emerged in their ancient patterns overhead, Jonas felt something he hadn't experienced in months, a sense of purpose that had nothing to do with his own pain and everything to do with the small, brave girl who had chosen to trust him with her story. He looked at Tessa, who had fallen asleep sitting up, her head nodding forward with exhaustion, and made a decision that surprised him with its certainty. Tomorrow they would continue west, but not as strangers thrown together by circumstance, as family chosen and claimed in the way that mattered most. He reached out carefully and adjusted his coat around her shoulders, and for the first time since Mary and Samuel had died, Jonas Hale allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he had something left to give after all. 3 days deeper into the desert, and Jonas had begun to understand that healing was not a destination, but a daily choice, made new each morning when Tessa's quiet presence reminded him that the world still held possibilities he had forgotten existed. She had a way of moving through their shared silence that felt like music, her small hands busy with tasks that needed no explanation, gathering kindling, mending a tear in his shirt with thread pulled from her own hem, braiding grass into rough rope with the patient skill of someone who had learned to make something useful from whatever the world offered. There was grace in her economy of motion, a kind of poetry in the way she could make a meal from hardtack and creek water feel like abundance. And Jonas found himself watching her with the wonder of a man discovering that beauty could exist even in the midst of profound loss. When she smiled, rare and precious as water in this parched landscape, it was like watching the sun break through storm clouds, and he felt something in his chest unclench, some tight fist of grief loosening its grip just enough to let him breathe. The morning brought them to a trading post that squatted like a weathered toad beside the trail, its adobe walls cracked and patched, its wooden porch sagging under the weight of too many harsh seasons. Jonas had intended to buy supplies and move on quickly, but Tessa had stopped at the sight of a woman hanging laundry behind the building, her movements sharp with anger as she snapped wet sheets in the desert wind. The woman was young, maybe 25, with dark hair escaping from a severe bun and eyes that held the particular exhaustion of someone fighting a losing battle against circumstances beyond her control. When she noticed them watching, her expression hardened into the defensive mask of someone who had learned to expect the worst from strangers. But Tessa stepped forward with the fearless compassion that seemed to be her defining characteristic. "Your baby's crying," she said simply, and Jonas realized he could indeed hear the thin wail of an infant coming from inside the building, a sound that cut through the desert air like a blade. The woman, Elena, she told them reluctantly, had been abandoned by her husband 3 months ago, left alone with a colicky baby and a trading post that barely earned enough to keep them fed. Her story spilled out in fragments as Tessa helped her fold the laundry, the child's natural empathy drawing confidences like water from a deep well. Jonas found himself fixing a broken shutter without being asked, his hands remembering the satisfaction of useful work, the simple pleasure of solving problems that had clear solutions. When Elena tried to pay him, he shook his head and gestured toward Tessa, who was now holding the baby with the easy competence of someone who had helped care for younger siblings. "The girl needs a proper meal," he said gruffly, and Eleanor's eyes filled with tears that she quickly blinked away, her pride warring with her gratitude in a way that Jonas understood completely. They stayed for dinner, and then for the night, and Jonas felt something shift in the careful distance he had maintained between himself and the world of the living. Watching Tessa with the baby was like witnessing a small miracle. The way her presence seemed to calm the fussy infant, her soft humming filling the cramped quarters with something that felt like peace. She had a gift for nurturing that seemed instinctive, born from her own deep need to be needed, to matter in someone's life in a way that couldn't be taken away by death or abandonment, or the casual cruelty of adults who saw children as burdens rather than blessings. Jonas found himself remembering Samuel at that age, the weight of his son's small body in his arms, the fierce protectiveness that had consumed him from the moment he first held his child. The memory should have been unbearable, but somehow, watching Tessa care for this stranger's baby with such gentle competence, the pain felt different, still present, but no longer sharp enough to cut him open from the inside. It was as if her capacity for love was teaching him that his own heart might still have room for something other than grief. That night, as they prepared to leave, Eleanor pressed a small cloth bundle into Tessa's hands, dried fruit and jerky, precious supplies that she could barely spare but offered anyway because she recognized something in the girl that called to her own maternal instincts. "You take care of each other," she said, looking between Tessa and Jonas with eyes that had learned to read the hidden stories people carried, and Jonas felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders like a familiar coat. It was a burden he had thought he never wanted to carry again, the terrible vulnerability of caring for someone whose safety depended on his choices, his strength, his ability to protect what mattered most. But as they rode away from the trading post, Tessa, walking beside his horse with renewed energy, her small face bright with the satisfaction of having helped someone who needed it, Jonas realized that maybe the weight of caring for another person wasn't a burden at all. Maybe it was the thing that gave life meaning, the anchor that kept a man from drifting away on the tide of his own sorrow. The desert stretched endlessly before them, but for the first time in months, Jonas didn't see it as a wasteland to be endured, but as a journey to be shared, each mile bringing them closer to something he couldn't yet name, but was beginning to believe in. Tessa hummed as she walked, a tuneless melody that seemed to rise from some deep well of contentment, and Jonas found himself humming along, his voice rusty from disuse, but growing stronger with each note. They were still broken, both of them, still carrying wounds that might never fully heal, but they were broken together now, and somehow that made all the difference in the world. The town of Silver Creek appeared on the horizon, like a mirage made real, its buildings wavering in the heat shimmer that rose from the desert floor, and Jonas felt his chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't quite name as he realized their journey together was approaching some kind of ending. They had been traveling for 2 weeks now, and in that time, something fundamental had shifted between them. Not just the easy companionship of shared hardship, but something deeper, more permanent, like the slow healing of a bone that had been broken and was finally beginning to knit back together. Tessa had grown stronger on the trail, her step more confident, her laughter coming more easily, and Jonas had watched her transformation with the wonder of a man witnessing a flower bloom in the desert. But with the town growing larger ahead of them, he found himself gripped by a fear he hadn't expected, the terror that she would leave him, that this strange and precious gift of companionship would prove as temporary as everything else he had ever loved. The thought of returning to his solitary grief felt unbearable now, like contemplating a return to blindness after learning to see. Silver Creek was the kind of town that existed because someone had decided it should, built around a silver mine that had played out years ago but left behind enough stubborn hope to sustain a few hundred souls who had nowhere else to go. The main street was wide and dusty, lined with false-fronted buildings that tried to look more prosperous than they were, and Jonas could see the familiar signs of a community that was slowly dying. Empty storefronts, peeling paint, the particular stillness that came when too many people had given up and moved on. But there was life here too, children playing in the street, women hanging laundry, men gathered outside the saloon discussing the weather and the price of cattle with the eternal optimism of people who had learned to find hope in small things. As they walked down the main street, Jonas noticed how people looked at them, not with suspicion, but with the careful interest of a community that was always hoping for new blood, new energy, new reasons to believe in the future. The boarding house was run by a widow named Mrs. Catherine Morrison, a woman in her 60s with silver hair and eyes that missed nothing, who took one look at Jonas and Tessa and seemed to understand immediately that they were more than just travelers passing through. She offered them 2 rooms, but Tessa shook her head and moved closer to Jonas, her small hand finding his with a trust that made his throat tight with emotion. "We'll take 1 room," he heard himself saying, and Mrs. Morrison nodded, as if she had expected nothing else, leading them upstairs to a clean, simple space with 2 narrow beds and a window that looked out over the town's modest main street. That night, as Tessa slept in the bed across from his, Jonas lay awake, listening to her quiet breathing and trying to imagine a future that included this fierce, gentle child who had somehow become the center of his world. The thought of leaving her here, of continuing his aimless wandering alone, felt like contemplating his own death, and he realized with startling clarity that somewhere along the trail, without his permission or conscious decision, she had become his daughter in every way that mattered. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor, a well-dressed woman named Mrs. Elizabeth Hartwell, who introduced herself as the representative of a children's aid society from back east, and Jonas felt his blood turn to ice as she explained that she had been tracking reports of an unaccompanied minor traveling with a single man. Her voice was kind but firm as she outlined the proper procedures for placing orphaned children with suitable families, and Jonas watched Tessa's face close down, her expression becoming carefully blank in the way he had learned to recognize as her defense against disappointment. Mrs. Hartwell had a list of families who were looking to adopt, good Christian people who could provide a proper home, education, stability, all the things that a drifting cattleman with a broken heart couldn't offer. The words felt like physical blows, each reasonable argument a nail in the coffin of the fragile hope he had been nurturing, and Jonas found himself struggling to breathe as the walls of the small room seemed to close in around him. But then Tessa spoke, her voice quiet but steady, cutting through Mrs. Hartwell's well-intentioned speech like a blade through silk. "I already have a family," she said, moving to stand beside Jonas's chair, her small hand resting on his shoulder with a possessiveness that made his heart swell with fierce pride. "Jonas is my pa now, and I'm his daughter, and we take care of each other." The simple declaration hung in the air like a challenge, and Jonas felt something break open in his chest. Not the sharp crack of new grief, but the slow, sweet ache of a heart learning to hope again. He looked up at this remarkable child who had chosen him as surely as he had chosen her, and found his voice at last. "She's right," he said, his words rough with emotion, but steady with conviction. "We're family now, and I'll fight anyone who tries to separate us." Mrs. Hartwell looked between them with the expression of someone who had seen enough of the world to recognize love when it appeared in unexpected forms, and after a long moment she nodded and put away her papers. The paperwork took 3 days to complete, 3 days of interviews and character references and legal formalities that felt both endless and miraculous, and when it was finished, Jonas found himself holding a document that made official what his heart had known for weeks. Tessa Quinn was now Tessa Hale, his daughter in the eyes of the law, as well as in the deeper truth of chosen love. They celebrated that night at the hotel restaurant, sharing a meal that tasted like victory and new beginnings. And Jonas watched Tessa's face glow with a happiness so pure it made his chest ache with gratitude. Later, as they walked through the quiet streets of Silver Creek under a canopy of desert stars, Tessa slipped her hand into his and looked up at him with eyes that held all the trust in the world. "Are we going to stay here, Pa?" she asked, and Jonas realized that for the first time in months, the future felt like something to be embraced rather than endured. "If you want to," he said, and her smile was brighter than all the stars above them, a light that would guide them both toward whatever came next, together.